The cabin of Flight 409 was dead silent, save for the heavy footsteps of armed airport security marching down the narrow aisle. At the front, Senior Flight Attendant Chloe Davenport stood with a triumphant smirk, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at a young black woman in Seat 1A. "Remove her," Chloe demanded, her voice dripping with venom. The passengers held their breath, waiting for the inevitable humiliation. But just as the officers reached for the young woman's shoulder, a towering, silver-haired figure stepped out from the private suite behind the cockpit. The smirk on Chloe's face didn't just fade, it shattered. Because the man now standing between the officers and the young woman wasn't just another passenger. He owned the entire airline. John F. Kennedy International Airport was a swirling vortex of rolling suitcases, frantic announcements, and the distinct, palpable stress of thousands of travelers trying to get somewhere else. It was a cold Tuesday evening in November, and Terminal 4 was particularly chaotic. For Melissa Jenkins, however, the chaos was nothing more than white noise. Melissa was 28, exhausted to her very bones, and quietly triumphant. She had just wrapped up a grueling 72-hour negotiation in Manhattan, securing a multi-million-dollar logistics software contract for the healthcare tech firm she had co-founded. Her code was going to streamline organ transplant deliveries across the East Coast. She had earned the dark circles under her eyes, and more importantly, she had earned the first-class ticket to London Heathrow, nestled in her Apple Wallet. Melissa wasn't dressed like a millionaire. She had changed out of her stiff corporate blazer and pencil skirt in a cramped airport restroom, trading them for her ultimate travel armor. A faded, oversized Yale University hoodie, a pair of thick black leggings, and worn-in white sneakers. She wanted to sleep for the entire 7-hour transatlantic flight. As she approached Gate B-22, the boarding process for Transglobal Airlines Flight 409 was just beginning. The massive Boeing 777-300ER sat beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a metal leviathan preparing to cross the ocean. Now welcoming our first-class and Diamond Medallion members to board through the priority lane, the gate agent announced over the PA system. Melissa adjusted her backpack, let out a long sigh of relief, and stepped into the priority lane. There were only a few other people in line, mostly older white men in tailored suits, and a wealthy-looking couple dripping in designer labels. Melissa stood quietly behind them, her phone illuminated with her boarding pass. Waiting at the end of the jet bridge, welcoming passengers aboard, was Senior Flight Attendant Chloe Davenport. Chloe was a 15-year veteran of the skies, a woman who prided herself on maintaining the prestige of the first-class cabin. Her uniform was impeccably tailored, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, immovable French twist, and her smile was a practiced, chilling curve of bright red lipstick. Chloe greeted the businessman with warm familiarity. "Welcome back, Mr. Hughes. Champagne is already waiting at your seat." She beamed at the designer couple. "So lovely to see you both. Right this way." Then, Melissa stepped forward. The practiced smile vanished from Chloe's face, replaced instantly by a hardened, scrutinizing glare. Her eyes swept over Melissa's faded hoodie, her braids pulled into a messy top knot, and the scuffed toes of her sneakers. Chloe physically shifted her body, blocking the entrance to the cabin. "Excuse me, honey," Chloe said, her tone laced with a patronizing sweetness that grated against the ears. "Main cabin and basic economy don't board for another 20 minutes. You need to wait in the terminal until your group is called." Melissa blinked, momentarily thrown by the sudden hostility. "I'm in Group 1, she said calmly, holding up her phone. "I'm in first class." Chloe didn't even look at the screen. She let out a small, dismissive scoff. "I highly doubt that. People often get confused by the zoning numbers. Let me see your phone." Without waiting for permission, Chloe snatched the phone from Melissa's hand. She stared at the digital boarding pass, her perfectly plucked eyebrows knitting together. The screen clearly displayed Melissa Jenkins, Seat 1A, first class. "This has to be a system glitch," Chloe muttered, more to herself than to Melissa. She tapped the screen aggressively, as if trying to force the pixels to rearrange themselves into an economy ticket. "Did you use a buddy pass? Because standby upgrades don't guarantee a seat in this cabin until the doors close." "It's not a buddy pass. I paid for the ticket." "In full," Melissa said, her voice dropping an octave, steady and firm. She reached out and gently but firmly took her phone back from Chloe's grip. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to find my seat." Chloe's jaw tightened. The skin around her mouth went white. She hated being challenged, especially by someone who didn't fit her narrow, prejudiced view of what success looked like. "Fine," Chloe clipped, her voice turning icy. "Seat 1A is to your left. Don't touch the amenity kits unless you're absolutely sure you're staying there." Melissa ignored the parting shot, stepping past the flight attendant and into the luxurious, dimly lit oasis of the first-class cabin. She found 1A, a spacious, private pod near the front window, stowed her backpack, and sank into the plush leather. She closed her eyes, telling herself to let it go. It was just one rude flight attendant. The hard part of her week was over. But as the cabin began to fill, Melissa realized the nightmare was just beginning. The first-class cabin hummed with the quiet, expensive sounds of clinking glass and rustling newspapers. Melissa had slipped on her noise-canceling headphones, hoping to retreat into her own world. Down the aisle, Chloe Davenport was making her rounds with a silver tray of pre-departure beverages. She offered warm towels, champagne, and sparkling water to Theodore Hughes, the wealthy hedge fund manager in 1B, and to the couple in row 2. But when Chloe passed row 1A, she deliberately turned her back, moving swiftly past Melissa without offering so much as a glance, let alone a drink. Melissa noticed, of course. The blatant microaggression stung, but she refused to give Chloe the satisfaction of a reaction. She pulled out her iPad and began reviewing a string of code, minding her own business. 10 minutes later, the boarding music suddenly faded. Chloe walked back down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the carpet. She stopped directly beside Melissa's pod. "Excuse me," Chloe said loudly. Melissa paused her music and pulled off one headphone. "Yes? I'm going to need you to gather your personal belongings and step out of the seat," Chloe said. She didn't whisper. She spoke at a volume specifically calculated to draw the attention of the other passengers in the cabin. Theodore Hughes peered over his Wall Street Journal, his eyes darting between the two women. Melissa frowned. "Why? Is there a problem with the seat?" "There is a problem with your ticket," Chloe lied smoothly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "The gate agent just radioed me. There was a fraudulent flag on the credit card used to purchase this upgrade. This seat actually belongs to a global services member who is boarding right now." Melissa's heart did a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. She knew exactly what card she had used, her own platinum corporate card, which had a limit higher than the entire cost of the flight crew's salaries combined. "That's impossible," Melissa said, keeping her voice incredibly level. "My card went through days ago. I have the receipt in my email. Would you like to see it?" "I don't need to see your emails," Chloe snapped, dropping the faux polite act. "I need you to vacate the seat. I have a 34E in the back, near the lavatories, which is where your original reservation was likely booked before this. Error. You can take that seat, or you can step off the aircraft and deal with customer service in the terminal." The blatant racism and classism hanging in the air was so thick it was suffocating. Melissa looked around the cabin. A few passengers looked uncomfortable and averted their eyes. Theodore Hughes, however, let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Could we please hurry this up?" Theodore grumbled, glaring at Melissa. "Some of us have early meetings in London. If the girl didn't pay for the seat, send her to the back so we can push back from the gate." Chloe shot Theodore an apologetic, sycophantic smile. "I'm so sorry for the delay, Mr. Hughes. I'm handling it." She turned her venomous gaze back to Melissa. "You heard him. Move. Now. You are causing a scene and delaying this flight." Melissa felt a hot flash of anger rise in her chest, but she clamped down on it. She knew the rules of this game. If she raised her voice, she would be labeled the angry black woman. If she showed aggression, she would give Chloe the exact ammunition she needed to justify kicking her off the plane. "I am not causing a scene, Chloe," Melissa said softly, reading the name tag pinned to the attendant's uniform. "I am sitting in the seat I paid for. I am not moving to 34E, and I am not getting off this plane. If there is an issue with my ticket, bring the gate agent onto the plane with the manifest to explain it to me." Chloe's face mottled with an ugly, dark red flush. Her authority in her domain was absolute, and this young woman in a hoodie was publicly defying her. "I am not going to ask you again," Chloe hissed, leaning in so close Melissa could smell the stale coffee on her breath. "If you do not get up right now, I am classifying you as a level 2 disruptive passenger. I will call ground security, and they will physically drag you off this aircraft. And let me tell you, honey, you will end up on a no-fly list for the rest of your life." The threat hung in the air, heavy and violent. Melissa looked directly into Chloe's eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. "Call them, then," Melissa whispered. Chloe gasped, genuinely shocked by the defiance. She straightened up, her chest heaving with indignation. "Fine. You brought this on yourself." Chloe spun on her heel and marched to the front of the cabin. She ripped the intercom phone off its cradle, her fingers punching in a code with furious speed. The cabin was deathly quiet as everyone listened to her side of the conversation. "Captain, it's Chloe. We have a situation in first class." "Yes, a hostile passenger. Seat 1A. She's occupying a seat she didn't pay for and is refusing to follow crew member instructions. Yes, she's being extremely aggressive and disruptive. I feel unsafe. I need airport police to board immediately and remove her." Chloe slammed the phone back onto the wall. She turned to look at Melissa, her eyes practically glowing with a sadistic sense of victory. The trap was set. The authorities were on their way. What Chloe didn't know, what no one in that cabin knew, was that the man sitting in the ultra-exclusive private suite behind the cockpit doors had heard every single word of the exchange, and he was already unbuckling his seatbelt. The next 12 minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The boarding process for the rest of the aircraft had been abruptly halted. Back in the terminal, hundreds of passengers were left standing in confusion at gate B22, their murmurs bleeding through the open cabin door. Inside first class, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Melissa Jenkins sat perfectly still in 1A. She had placed her iPad back into her bag and sat with her hands resting openly on her lap, a deliberate posture meant to convey absolute non-aggression. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of calm composure. She knew the statistics. She knew exactly how quickly a situation could escalate when a white woman in authority summoned law enforcement on a black woman who dared to stand her ground. Melissa was terrified, but she was also stubbornly, resolutely right. And she was not going to let a racist flight attendant bully her out of a seat she had paid $3,000 for. Down the aisle, Chloe Davenport was putting on a masterclass in theatrical victimhood. She had retreated to the galley, where she stood whispering frantically to a junior flight attendant, occasionally pressing a manicured hand to her chest and shooting fearful, wide-eyed glances toward Melissa. "I just don't know what she's capable of," Chloe hissed, loudly enough for the front row to hear. She was so aggressive. "I've never felt this threatened in my 15 years with Transglobal." Theodore Hughes, the hedge fund manager in 1B, shook his head in sympathetic disgust. "It's a disgrace," he muttered to his seatmate, an older woman dripping in Cartier jewelry. "They let anyone fly. First these days, no respect for decorum." Then, the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots echoed down the jet bridge. Two officers from the Port Authority Police Department stepped onto the aircraft. They were large men, their duty belts heavy with tasers, radios, and sidearms. The sheer physical presence of the armed officers sucked whatever remaining air was left in the cabin. Chloe practically lunged toward them, her face instantly melting into an expression of desperate relief. "Officers, thank God you're here," she breathed, her voice dropping an octave to sound fragile and shaken. The lead officer, a stern-faced man with the name tag O'Malley, held up a hand. "Are you the crew member who called it in?" "Yes, I'm Chloe, the senior flight attendant," she said, wringing her hands together. She pointed a perfectly polished fingernail directly at Melissa. "It's the passenger in 1A. She bypassed the gate agent, stole a seat that belongs to a global services member, and when I politely asked her to relocate to her actual seat in economy, she became completely unhinged." Officer O'Malley frowned, his hand resting instinctively near his utility belt. "Unhinged how, ma'am?" "She refused to comply with crew instructions, became verbally abusive, and physically threatened me." Chloe lied without missing a beat. The sheer audacity of the fabrication sent a chill down Melissa's spine. "She is a level 2 disruption. I need her removed from this aircraft immediately before she hurts someone." The officers exchanged a brief, professional glance. "Standard procedure, in a post. 9, 11. Aviation World dictated that the flight crew's word was absolute law. If a senior attendant felt unsafe, the passenger was removed. Questions were asked later, usually in a windowless interrogation room in the terminal. O'Malley and his partner, Officer Davies, marched down the narrow aisle and stopped directly beside Melissa's pod. "Ma'am," O'Malley said, his voice loud, commanding, and stripped of any warmth. "I need you to stand up, gather your belongings, and step off the aircraft." Melissa looked up at the officers. She didn't raise her voice, but she made sure every word was crystal clear. "Officers, my name is Melissa Jenkins. I have not threatened anyone, nor have I raised my voice. I am sitting in the seat I purchased. My boarding pass was scanned at the gate. I have the receipt on my phone." "That's a lie," Chloe interjected from behind the officers. "It's a fraudulent ticket. She needs to go." "Ma'am, we are not going to argue with you," Officer Davies said, leaning slightly closer to Melissa, his hand hovering over his handcuffs. "The flight crew has requested your removal. This is no longer a customer service issue. It is a trespassing issue. If you do not stand up and exit the aircraft under your own power, we will be forced to physically remove you. You have 5 seconds to comply." The entire cabin was dead silent. Every eye was locked on Melissa. Theodore Hughes was smirking. Chloe stood tall, her chest puffed out in absolute victory, waiting to watch the humiliation unfold. 5. Davies counted. Melissa's vision blurred with unshed tears of sheer frustration. She slowly reached for the buckle of her seatbelt. She had fought hard, but she knew she couldn't fight the police. 4. Melissa's fingers touched the cold metal of the buckle. 3. Before Davies could say 2, a sharp, heavy click echoed from the very front of the cabin. The sound came from the heavy, reinforced security door situated between the cockpit and the first-class galley, the entrance to the ultra-exclusive private Vanguard suite, a space completely off-limits to everyone except high-ranking government officials or airline executives. The door swung open, and a man stepped out into the aisle. He was in his late 60s, with thick silver hair, piercing cobalt blue eyes, and the kind of tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than a luxury sedan. He didn't just walk. He commanded the space, radiating an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. Jonathan Hayes, the billionaire CEO and majority shareholder of Vanguard Aviation, the parent conglomerate that owned Transglobal Airlines, stood between the armed officers and Melissa Jenkins. The silence in the cabin shifted from tense to paralyzed. Chloe Davenport's smirk didn't just fade, it completely evaporated, leaving her face a pale, horrified mask. She had seen Jonathan Hayes in corporate training videos and on the cover of Forbes magazine, but never in person. No flight crew was ever notified when he flew incognito. Hayes didn't look at Chloe. He didn't look at the staring passengers. He looked directly at the Port Authority officers. "Stand down, gentlemen," Hayes commanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, rumbling gravity that immediately made the officers freeze. Officer O'Malley blinked, clearly taken aback by the interruption. "Excuse me, sir. We are handling a disruptive passenger situation. I need you to return to your seat." "I said, stand down," Hayes repeated, his tone sharpening into a blade. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a solid black, titanium identification card. It bore the Vanguard Aviation crest and a level 1 global security clearance badge. He held it up for O'Malley to read. O'Malley's eyes widened. The color drained from his face as he recognized the name, the title, and the supreme authority the card represented. "Mr. Hayes," O'Malley stammered, immediately taking a massive step back and dropping his hands away from his belt. "Apologies, sir. We were called by the flight crew regarding a trespasser." "There is no trespasser on this aircraft," Hayes said coldly, turning his imposing frame to finally face the flight attendant. Chloe looked as though she might vomit. Her hands were shaking violently by her sides. "And Mr. Hayes?" "Sir," she squeaked, her voice entirely stripped of its previous venom. "I didn't know you were on board." "Clearly," Hayes said. The single word felt like a physical blow. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Chloe. The passengers in first class, including Theodore Hughes, were now shrinking back into their seats, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. "I have been sitting in the Vanguard suite with the door ajar for the last 20 minutes, Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent cabin. I heard every single word spoken in this aisle. I heard this young woman state, calmly and politely, that she had paid for her seat. And I heard you, Chloe, wasn't it? He glanced at her name tag with utter disdain. I heard you berate her, lie about a fraudulent charge, attempt to forcibly downgrade her, and then fabricate a story about being physically threatened to law enforcement. Sir, please, you don't understand. The system, Chloe choked out, tears of genuine panic now welling in her eyes. Do not interrupt me, Hayes snapped, the sudden volume making Chloe flinch violently. You weaponized security protocols to feed your own prejudice. You attempted to humiliate a paying first-class passenger simply because she did not fit your archaic, bigoted profile of what wealth looks like. Hayes turned his attention back to Melissa. The fierce anger in his eyes softened as he looked at her. He offered a small, respectful nod. Miss Jenkins. I am Jonathan Hayes. On behalf of this entire airline, I am profoundly and deeply sorry for the abhorrent treatment you have endured today. Melissa, still holding her seatbelt buckle, let out a shaky breath. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Hayes turned back to the officers. Officers, you can return to the terminal. The only person leaving this aircraft today will be the employee who filed a false police report. Chloe let out a strangled sob. Mr. Hayes, please, I have a pension. I've been here 15 years. Hayes's expression was carved from granite. Then you should have known better. Gather your personal belongings, Chloe. You are fired, effective immediately. The silence that followed Jonathan Hayes's decree was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only exists in the immediate aftermath of a bomb detonating. In the span of 60 seconds, Chloe Davenport's world had completely unraveled. The power she had wielded so ruthlessly just moments before had been stripped away by the one man on the planet who held absolute authority over her career. Fired? Chloe gasped, the word barely making it past her trembling lips. The color had entirely drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a garish mask slapped onto a ghost. Mr. Hayes, you can't be serious. I was just following security protocols. I thought her ticket was fraudulent. Do not insult my intelligence, Chloe, Jonathan Hayes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I built transglobal airlines from a regional fleet into a global empire by understanding exactly what happens on my aircraft. You didn't check her ticket. You didn't consult the gate manifest. You looked at a young black woman in a hoodie sitting in first class, and you made a conscious, bigoted decision that she didn't belong. Chloe took a step backward, bumping into the galley counter. The tears were flowing freely now, ruining her mascara. Sir, please, it was a mistake. A misunderstanding. I have a family. I've given 15 years of my life to this airline. And in 15 seconds, you demonstrated that your core values are entirely incompatible with the Vanguard Aviation brand. Hayes countered smoothly, devoid of any sympathy. You did not just insult a paying passenger. You weaponized law enforcement to intimidate and humiliate her. You lied to these officers. He gestured to O'Malley and Davies, who were now standing awkwardly in the aisle, realizing the gravity of the false report they had almost acted upon. Hayes turned to the officers. Gentlemen, the only disruption on this aircraft is the former employee currently having a meltdown in my galley. I apologize for the waste of city resources. Please escort her off the jet bridge so we can board the rest of our passengers. Officer O'Malley, looking thoroughly chastised and eager to appease the billionaire CEO, nodded sharply. Understood, Mr. Hayes. He turned his stern gaze onto Chloe. It was the exact same look he had given Melissa just 5 minutes earlier. Ma'am, gather your things. Now. Chloe let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. Her hands shook violently as she reached into the crew stowage compartment to retrieve her designer rolling tote and uniform blazer. The pristine image she had projected was entirely shattered. As Chloe began her slow, agonizing walk down the aisle toward the exit, the true weight of her karma settled in. She had to pass the open cockpit door, where the captain and first officer were watching her dismissal in stunned silence. She had to step out into the jet bridge, where dozens of economy passengers, the very people she had felt so superior to, were still lined up, waiting to board. Through the open cabin door, the murmurs of the waiting crowd drifted in. Is that the flight attendant? Why are the cops taking her off? Did she get arrested? Chloe ducked her head, sobbing openly now. her face buried in her hands as she was led away by the very security forces she had summoned to terrorize someone else. The heavy cabin door remained open, letting in the cool airport air, but inside first class, the atmosphere was still thick with tension. Hayes wasn't finished. He slowly turned his piercing blue eyes toward row 1B. Theodore Hughes, the wealthy hedge fund manager who had so loudly complained about Melissa and demanded she be thrown to the back of the plane, was suddenly attempting to make himself as small as physically possible in his spacious leather seat. He had picked up his Wall Street Journal again, pretending to read, but the paper was visibly shaking in his hands. "And you?" Hayes said. The two words cracked like a whip through the cabin. Theodore slowly lowered the newspaper, swallowing hard. He attempted a weak, unctuous smile. "Mr. Hayes, an absolute pleasure. I'm Theodore Hughes, managing partner at Oakmont Capital. I entirely agree with your handling of the situation. That attendant was utterly out of line." "Save your breath, Mr. Hughes," Hayes interrupted, his expression carved from stone. "I heard you, too. I heard you complain about decorum and demand that Miss Jenkins be sent to the back so you wouldn't be delayed. You enabled that flight attendant's behavior. You cheered on the discrimination." Theodore's fake smile faltered. "Now, hold on, Jonathan. If I may call you Jonathan, I was simply reacting to the disturbance. I have a very important board meeting in London tomorrow. Time is money, as I'm sure you understand." "I understand character," Hayes replied coldly, "and I understand complicity. The flight crew will be serving you for the duration of this trip, Mr. Hughes, because unlike the woman you just tried to defend, I honor legally purchased tickets. But let me be perfectly clear. This will be the very last time you fly on Transglobal Airlines. When we land at Heathrow, your frequent flyer account will be permanently revoked, and you will be added to our internal no-fly list." Theodore's jaw dropped. The wealthy executive was suddenly stripped of all his bluster, humiliated in front of the entire cabin. He opened his mouth to argue, but the lethal glare from Hayes silenced him instantly. Theodore slumped back in his seat, his face burning a deep, embarrassing crimson. With the first-class cabin finally purged of its immediate, suffocating toxicity, the electrified tension that had gripped Flight 409 began to slowly, almost palpably, dissipate. The heavy, muffled thud of the jet bridge door closing in the distance signaled the final, definitive end of Chloe Davenport's career. The low, familiar hum of the Boeing 777's massive engines began to spin up, a steady vibration that seemed to ground the remaining passengers back into reality. Jonathan Hayes stood in the center of the aisle, a towering monument of absolute corporate authority. He took a long, slow breath, visibly allowing the cold, ruthless armor he wore as a billionaire CEO to drop from his broad shoulders. The terrifying edge in his posture softened, replaced by the refined, steady demeanor of a man who valued respect above all else. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his attention back to row 1A. Melissa Jenkins had remained entirely silent during the swift and brutal delivery of corporate retribution. She sat with her back pressed firmly against the plush leather seat, her hands still resting flat and open on her lap. Her knuckles were visibly tight, and her chest rose and fell with shallow, measured breaths. She had survived the confrontation, but the adrenaline was still coursing fiercely through her veins, leaving a cold, trembling aftermath in its wake. She looked up at the silver-haired titan, her dark eyes reflecting a complex mixture of profound relief, lingering shock, and a guarded caution. "Miss Jenkins," Jonathan said, his voice lowering into a soothing, deeply resonant register that was a jarring contrast to the weaponized tone he had used on his now former staff. He didn't just stand over her, looming in the narrow space. Instead, Jonathan Hayes, a man whose net worth rivaled the GDP of small nations, deliberately lowered his towering frame. He dropped to one knee right there in the aisle, bringing his piercing cobalt blue eyes perfectly level with hers. A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. The remaining passengers, still reeling from the spectacle they had just witnessed, stared in quiet, absolute awe. It was a gesture of immense, unadulterated respect, entirely stripping away the inherent power dynamics of the situation. "I cannot possibly apologize enough for what you just experienced on my aircraft," Jonathan said, his words carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of genuine remorse. It is a catastrophic, unforgivable failure of my airline's training, oversight, and culture. No passenger should ever be subjected to that kind of humiliation, let alone an esteemed guest who paid a premium for our hospitality. I give you my personal word that this will be addressed at the highest corporate level by tomorrow morning. There will be an internal reckoning, Miss Jenkins. Melissa stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of corporate PR spin. She found none. The man was entirely sincere. She let out a long, shaky breath, a breath she felt like she had been holding for an hour. The defensive tension finally bled out of her spine, and she allowed her hands to relax into a natural posture. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Melissa replied, her voice soft but remarkably steady. "Honestly, for a moment there, I thought I was going to end up in handcuffs and dragged through the terminal just for having the audacity to sit in the seat I purchased." "Not on my watch," Jonathan said firmly, his jaw setting into a hard line at the mere thought of the injustice. "Never on my watch." As he prepared to stand, Jonathan's gaze briefly flicked downward. Resting on the carpeted floor, tucked neatly near the metallic base of Melissa's seat pod, was her open canvas tote bag. Peeking out from the top was a sleek, matte black laptop. It wasn't the machine itself that caught his attention, but the distinct, geometric silver decal pressed perfectly into the center of the lid. A stylized A, intersecting seamlessly with a minimalist wireframe globe. Jonathan froze. His cobalt eyes narrowed, a sharp spark of recognition flashing across his features. He leaned in just a fraction of an inch, scrutinizing the logo, before his gaze snapped back up to Melissa's face. He looked at her entirely differently now, not just as a wronged passenger, but with the sudden, intense calculation of a fellow visionary. "Wait a moment," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper of disbelief. He ran a hand through his thick silver hair. "Melissa Jenkins. Are you the Melissa Jenkins? The founder and lead systems architect of Apex Logistics Solutions?" Melissa blinked, entirely caught off guard by the sudden pivot. She had spent the last 3 grueling days pitching her complex supply chain software to a boardroom full of skeptical hospital administrators in Manhattan. She certainly didn't expect the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar global aviation conglomerate to casually recognize her obscure startup's logo in the middle of an airport runway crisis. "Yes," she said slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I am. How in the world do you know about Apex?" A wide, genuinely delighted smile broke across Jonathan's face, entirely transforming his severe, intimidating features into something remarkably warm. He let out a low, rich chuckle of sheer disbelief, shaking his head. "How do I know about Apex?" Jonathan repeated, his tone suddenly brimming with profound, professional admiration. "Miss Jenkins, my executive operations team has been obsessively reviewing your proprietary tracking algorithms for the past 4 weeks. Vanguard Aviation's cargo division currently handles nearly 70% of the emergency medical freight on the eastern seaboard. For years, we have been desperately bleeding resources looking for a way to optimize our cold chain supply routes for organ transplants and volatile vaccines. We hit a wall." He gestured enthusiastically to her laptop. "Then, your pitch deck crossed my desk. My chief technology officer reviewed your routing protocols and explicitly called your work revolutionary. We've been trying to figure out how to get you in a room." Melissa's eyes widened, the sheer magnitude of his words temporarily wiping away the trauma of the past 20 minutes. Your CTO has been reviewing my code?" "Line by line," Jonathan confirmed, his eyes practically gleaming. He looked her up and down, taking in her faded, oversized Yale hoodie, the messy top knot of her braids, and the scuffed white sneakers. The corner of his mouth twitched with immense amusement. "I must admit, the intensive corporate profile my analysts pulled on you painted the picture of a ruthless, brilliant, incredibly intimidating tech titan. I certainly didn't expect to find you getting bullied in my first-class cabin by a rogue flight attendant while wearing a college sweatshirt." A genuine, bright laugh escaped Melissa's lips, the remaining cortisol finally draining completely from her system. It felt incredibly good to laugh. "It was a very, very long week of negotiations in New York, Mr. Hayes. I barely slept. The hoodie is my reward for surviving the boardroom. Call me Jonathan, please," he insisted, standing up gracefully and offering her his hand. Melissa took it, and he shook her hand with a firm, deeply respectful grip, the kind of handshake reserved for absolute equals. And considering the absolute, unmitigated disaster my staff just put you through, Jonathan continued, releasing her hand and gesturing down the aisle, the very least I can do is make the rest of this transatlantic journey somewhat comfortable. He turned his head and looked toward the front galley. A new flight attendant, a young, terrified-looking man whose name tag read David, was hovering nervously near the curtain. He had clearly been hastily promoted from the main cabin to replace the banished Chloe, and he looked as though he was expecting to be fired at any second. "David, son," Jonathan called out smoothly. The young man practically jumped to attention, his back ramrod straight. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. Right here, sir." "Bring Miss Jenkins a bottle of our vintage Dom Perignon immediately." "Leave the bottle," Jonathan instructed, his tone demanding but perfectly polite. "Furthermore, anything else she requests for the duration of this flight, food, duty-free, whatever she desires, is entirely complimentary. See to it that she is treated like absolute royalty." "Right away, Mr. Hayes," David squeaked, immediately turning to dig into the high-end beverage carts. Jonathan turned back to Melissa, his voice dropping back into a confidential murmur. "Furthermore, Melissa, my private Vanguard suite directly behind the cockpit is currently sitting empty. It has a fully flat, memory-foam king-sized bed, a private enclosed lavatory, a shower, and absolutely no interruptions from the cabin. It is completely soundproof. I insist you take it." Melissa looked past him at the heavy, reinforced oak door of the Vanguard suite. It was a legendary space, the holy grail of commercial aviation, rumored to be reserved only for heads of state or A-list royalty. "Jonathan, I couldn't possibly. That's your private suite. I'm perfectly fine right here in 1A. I have a perfectly fine, deeply comfortable seat waiting for me back in row 4, Jonathan countered, offering a quick, charming wink. "Besides, I believe we have a great deal of highly lucrative business to discuss regarding Apex Logistics. But that can wait until we land in London. Right now, you are exhausted, and you need to sleep." Melissa looked at the man, realizing he wasn't going to take no for an answer. She felt a massive, rushing wave of profound vindication wash over her soul. She stood up, grabbed her canvas tote bag, and slung her backpack over her shoulder. She turned and looked around the first-class cabin one last time. Theodore Hughes was staring firmly at the blank wall of the bulkhead, his face a mottled, embarrassed red, radiating bitter, impotent envy. The other passengers, who had silently judged her just 30 minutes prior, were now watching her with quiet, undisguised awe. She had won. Completely and totally. "Thank you, Jonathan," Melissa said softly, her voice filled with deep gratitude. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Melissa. Sleep well." As Melissa walked past the shattered remnants of Theodore Hughes's ego, leaving the hostile cabin behind to step into the unparalleled, silent luxury of the billionaire's private flying fortress, she smiled. She realized that hard karma didn't just hit back against those who deserved it. Sometimes, if you held your ground and refused to shrink yourself, karma upgraded you to a completely different stratosphere. The descent into London Heathrow Airport was as smooth as glass, a jarringly peaceful contrast to the turbulent storm of bigotry and entitlement that had erupted just hours earlier. Inside the ultra-exclusive Vanguard suite, Melissa Jenkins slowly opened her eyes. For a brief, disorienting second, she forgot where she was. She was enveloped in the plush embrace of a fully flat, memory foam mattress, completely isolated from the relentless drone of the Boeing 777's massive engines. Ambient, warm lighting illuminated the polished wood paneling of the private cabin. It was a sanctuary. Melissa stretched her legs, the exhaustion of her 72-hour negotiation in Manhattan finally melting out of her muscles. She had slept for 6 uninterrupted hours, heavily and deeply, shielded from the prying eyes and toxic whispers of the first-class cabin outside her reinforced door. Sitting up, she ran a hand through her braids. The sheer surrealism of the flight washed over her. She had boarded as an exhausted entrepreneur in a faded Yale hoodie, only to be racially profiled, threatened with arrest, and ultimately vindicated by the billionaire owner of the airline. It felt like a fever dream. As she changed back into her comfortable travel clothes, Melissa reached for her phone. The moment the device connected to the local British cellular network, it practically vibrated out of her hand. Her screen exploded with a relentless, cascading barrage of notifications. Text messages from friends, missed calls from her co-founders at Apex Logistics, and thousands of alerts from social media platforms she rarely even checked. While Melissa had been resting at 30,000 feet, the internet had been wide awake, and it was furious. A passenger in row 2, the older woman dripping in Cartier jewelry, had discreetly recorded the entire altercation on her smartphone. The video, boldly titled "Racist Flight Attendant Gets Fired by Billionaire CEO Mid-Flight," had been uploaded the instant the passenger purchased the onboard Wi-Fi. By the time the aircraft's wheels touched the British tarmac, the clip had amassed over 12 million views across 3 different platforms. Melissa scrolled through the timeline, her jaw dropping. The digital karma was swift, brutal, and absolutely surgical. Chloe Davenport was no longer just an unemployed flight attendant. She was the face of a massive, global public relations nightmare. Internet sleuths had mobilized with terrifying efficiency. They had already uncovered Chloe's professional profiles, unearthing a documented history of past complaints from other minority passengers that had previously been swept under the rug. Industry insiders were actively commenting on the viral posts, verifying that Chloe's name had been officially placed on an international aviation blacklist. She would never work in hospitality, travel, or customer service again. The comfortable, secure pension she had cried over in the galley was frozen indefinitely, pending a ruthless corporate investigation by Vanguard Aviation into her blatant misuse of security protocols and false police reporting. Chloe's legacy was permanently cemented as a cautionary tale of unchecked prejudice. Melissa stepped out of the private suite as the massive aircraft finally docked at the gate. The heavy security door clicked shut behind her. The remaining first-class passengers were waiting quietly to disembark, but as Melissa appeared, the dynamic shifted entirely. They gave her a wide, deeply respectful berth, averting their eyes or offering small, apologetic nods. The collective guilt in the cabin was palpable. As Melissa walked down the aisle toward the exit, her gaze fell upon row 1B. Theodore Hughes was frantically typing on his phone, his face a glistening mask of panicked sweat. His earlier arrogance had entirely evaporated, replaced by the terrified realization that he, too, had been caught on the viral video, loudly demanding that Melissa be sent to the back of the plane. But the internet was the least of his immediate problems. 2 Vanguard Aviation elite ground security agents, dressed in sharp black suits, were already waiting for him at the threshold of the jet bridge door. "Mr. Hughes?" the lead agent stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. He stepped deliberately into Theodore's path, blocking his exit. He held out a stiff, legally binding document printed on heavy, watermarked corporate letterhead. "I am officially serving you with a lifetime ban from Transglobal Airlines and all Vanguard Aviation global subsidiaries." Theodore stared at the paper as if it were radioactive. "You can't do this," he hissed, his hands trembling with humiliated rage. "I am a Diamond Medallion member. I have a board meeting in an hour. Your Diamond Medallion status has been permanently revoked, sir," the agent continued, his volume raised just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly. "Your frequent flyer miles have been seized, and your return flight to New York has been canceled without a refund. You are trespassing on Vanguard property. You will need to find an alternative carrier, permanently. Now, please come with us." Melissa watched in profound satisfaction as the formerly arrogant hedge fund manager was unceremoniously escorted away by security. His reputation, his morning board meeting, and his bloated ego were entirely ruined. He had enabled discrimination to save a few minutes of his time, and it had cost him his standing in the corporate world. Melissa adjusted her backpack over her shoulders and stepped off the jet bridge into the bustling, brightly lit expanse of Terminal 4. Waiting at the end of the corridor, looking impeccably sharp and entirely unbothered by the overnight flight, was Jonathan Hayes. The billionaire CEO was flanked by 2 executive assistants, both holding sleek leather briefcases. "Good morning, Melissa," Jonathan said, a warm, genuine smile completely replacing his stern, imposing corporate facade. "I trust the suite was comfortable?" "It was incredible, Jonathan." "Thank you," Melissa replied, matching his smile. "I saw the news online. It seems the situation escalated significantly while we were in the air. Vanguard Aviation has a strict zero-tolerance policy for bigotry, and I prefer to lead by example," Jonathan stated firmly, his piercing cobalt eyes entirely serious. Our global public relations team has already issued a formal, public apology to you. And as of this morning, we are overhauling our entire crew training program worldwide. But I am not just here to apologize again. He gestured toward the private, frosted glass doors of the Concorde First Class Lounge a few yards away. My executive team in New York fast-tracked the paperwork while we were flying over the Atlantic. I spent the last few hours reviewing the final terms of the Apex Logistics software integration. Melissa's breath caught in her throat. The massive, multi-million-dollar deal she had been fighting for all week in Manhattan, the very reason she was exhausted enough to wear a hoodie in first class, was suddenly standing right in front of her, thousands of miles away from Wall Street. We want exclusive licensing for your cold chain algorithms for our entire medical freight division, Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a smooth, commanding professional cadence. Your code is going to revolutionize how quickly we can transport vital organs and emergency medical supplies across the globe. It is a $60 million contract over the next 5 years, Melissa. And I want to sign it right now, over breakfast in the lounge, before your competitors realize exactly who they missed out on. Melissa stood in the middle of the busy London terminal, the full weight of her entire journey finally settling over her shoulders. She had boarded that plane exhausted, severely underestimated, and targeted by the worst kind of superficial prejudice. But she had categorically refused to yield. She had held her ground, demanded her rightful space, and let her own undeniable excellence speak for itself. She looked at the billionaire CEO, her lips curving into a confident, brilliant, and unstoppable smile. "Lead the way, Jonathan," Melissa said, her voice ringing with the quiet power of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. "Let's close this deal. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of hard karma and ultimate vindication. When prejudice tries to push you to the back of the line, never be afraid to stand your ground and claim the seat you earned." Melissa's journey proves that true success and absolute dignity will always outshine arrogance and bigotry in the end. If this real-life drama got your blood pumping and you loved watching instant karma strike back against those who deserved it, please hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm to push these powerful stories to more people. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the truth always comes to light. Finally, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories. See you in the next video.